Let's welcome up Joe.
But let's just jump right into it. Fresh bread, as you guys know, Ron had kicked this kind of topic or header or whatever you want to call it off by just, hey, let's just have an opportunity to invite people in to kind of where you are with God. So this morning, I'd simply like to invite you into a conversation that the Lord and I have been having. Last time I shared with you on this topic, the tongue in cheek was a little doughy, and to this morning, let's just say this one might be kind of half baked. But I'm not going to exegete a passage. I'm going to talk about a couple of passages. But as I said, it's a topic. It's really a place where the Lord and I have been over the last number of months, and just invite you into that. And maybe there's some things here that might kick off some thoughts or things for you to talk to the Lord about. Somewhere in the 1830s, I don't know the exact year, a man was born. His name was James Anthony Carlin. And somewhere around the Civil War, he began to have children. He had 4 sons. Walter Raleigh Carlin was one of his sons. And those 4 sons resided in the Cumberland Gap area of Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, the Cumberland Plateau, specifically Putnam County, the county seat being Cookeville. Some of you are probably familiar with that area. Beautiful part of the country. But as those 4 men and their families grew, they worked together. They were very enterprising, and in fact, they met every. They were into cattle and farming and industry, and some of the deals they did might be a little shady, or have been a little bit shady, but they worked together and accumulated quite a bit of wealth, quite frankly. And they met once a week, their families, for dinner. And it was basically a business meeting, but it was a very regular type of meeting that they had to discuss business. Walter Raleigh had several children. One of those was James Anthony Carlin II. James Anthony Carlin II had 2 children, one of which was James Anthony Carlin IV. I think you guys are kind of getting the pattern. Well, all that to say, by the time this wealth began to transfer, and each generation multiplied the wealth. They applied their skills, et cetera, to multiply wealth. James Anthony Carlin IV did the same. Later in life, had left his wife, married his mistress, and for the next 30 years continued to accumulate, and all in a good way. A pretty tidy sum, if you will, right? And about 25 years into that second marriage, in hindsight, what became evident was this mistress turned wife basically systematically absconded that wealth from the family. And it was it actually was after his death, it was an 8-figure estate. Not too bad. 2 commas for those that are a little slow in the uptake this morning. Molly Ann and I have 4 children. Our oldest is our daughter. Her name is Carlin. She got her name from Molly Ann. Molly Ann's maiden name is Carlin. Molly Ann's father is James Anthony Carlin IV. We watched an inheritance vanish. That in itself is a long story. It's a great fodder for a Southern novel. And many of you may have experienced something like that before. And I'm 60 years of age now. My father's deceased. He left the planet about 3 years ago. Before he died, I'm the middle of 3 sons. Before he died, my mother and I, with my dad's consent, set up a an irrevocable living trust for her. It just made things easier when he passed away. And I'm basically helping her manage her affairs. Not the same size of an estate. All that to say, that's kind of on my mind. Anybody in here been through that or in that place or whatever? And we're probably even thinking about that with our own progeny. You know, what do we do? So this whole idea of inheritance is a pretty big topic for me at the moment. And the Lord's just began to take me into some places in the Word. That's what I'd like to share with some of which I'd like to share with you this morning. So last week, Hutch shared with us from, was it Luke 15? I think it was Luke 15, the story of the prodigal son, right? And obviously one of the key elements in the story of the prodigal son, or really many say the prodigal father. You know, prodigal means wasteful. And from the father's standpoint, you know, the son, it's easy to pick on the son that left who wasted his inheritance. But likewise, the father was wasteful in the sense that he was extremely extravagant when he came back, right? And we all know that story. And I think the beautiful thing about that, to me at least, is when the son came back and welcomed, the father actually cut him back into the will. And you think about this, like I said, I may take some liberty with some of the thoughts here that the Lord and I are talking about. So again, if I don't exegete it exactly correctly or the way you think, give me a little bit of slack on that, right? But the way I see it, at least, the father cut him back in. So if you're the oldest son who's supposed to receive a double portion, and by the way, in the Hebrew culture, the double portion, as you probably know, was given to the eldest son because when the father was out of the picture, the eldest son took over as the patriarch of the entire family. So he was compensated, if you will, or equipped to govern the family, if you will. So here's the son, the oldest son, who's supposed to get a double portion. The younger son comes to dad and, like Hutch shared with us, hey, you're as good as dead to me. Just give me my money and I'm out of here. And he goes and he wastes it, right? So the oldest son's got his 2/3. And when the younger son comes back, he cuts him back in. So he gets diluted down to what, 44% instead of 66 or something like that. I mean, I'd have a chip on my shoulder, probably, okay? And many of you have probably been in situations like that in business. Okay. Anyway, the Hutch took us in the direction of focusing not so much on the inheritance and the wasting thereof, as much as or more so on the compassion of the father toward the son, regardless of what the kid did with the money. Right? And I thought that was brilliant. That was great. I've thought a lot about that, and I'm still thinking a lot about it. But with regard to inheritance itself, the key place I'd like to go this morning is Psalms 16, 5-6. As we do, you know, we could go through tons and tons and tons of examples in the scripture with regard to inheritance. You know, Esau probably comes to mind for some of you, right? He's the grandson of Abraham. Abraham was loaded with worldly wealth, absolutely loaded. Okay, Isaac, I don't know if Isaac got a double portion. I don't know, or if he got it all, but he got the lion's share. And then now he's got two sons, Esau and Jacob, and Esau's lined up for a double portion of that. I mean, so he's got some loot coming his way. And as you know, he basically trades his birthright for a bowl of lentil soup. I mean, I would have at least gone for like lobster mac and cheese or something like that, but lentil soup. And then Adam, we know about Adam. Adam exchanged the truth of God for a lie. He exchanged a truth system or a kingdom for a kingdom of darkness. And really what he did was he exchanged fathers. He divorced his father and the father of truth, and he embraced the father of lies. Now, what came with that was an inheritance, which was the kingdom of darkness. So what he got was a result of who he teamed up with, if you will, right? We could go on and on and on. So here in Psalm 16, 5 through 6, this is David talking to Father, Yahweh. I have chosen you alone as my inheritance. You are my prize, my pleasure, and my portion. You hold my destiny and its timing in your hands. Your pleasant path leads me to pleasant places. I'm overwhelmed by the privileges that come with following you. I'd like to take this in just the little bites, again, not to exegete it line by line per se, but again, just as Father and I talk about it and some things I'm ruminating on. Let's take the first piece, chosen. David says, I have chosen you alone as my inheritance. And as we all know, David was a blessed person. He was a blessed man. He had a lot of the things of this world, if you will, right? He had his trials, of course. But when you think of inheritance, it's a given, but basically inheritance is the property or the wealth that someone else has accumulated that they've chosen to give you, right? It's the product of somebody else's work. I get something without having to work for it, if you will. I mean, that's a good thing. And property, when you think about property, or as I've thought about property, if you will, or wealth, property is a result that's created from co-laboring with God. So here, we take our labor units, our time, our energy, our talent, right? Our labor units, and we apply those to what God has already created. So Adam in the garden, he worked or he cultivated what God already provided. For the gardeners in here, God provides certain things, seed, soil, sun, water. We apply our labor units to that, and there's a yield. It's just the way God made it. He created it that way. We know that, right? It's this co-laboring of our labor units with what God provides and product or wealth as a result, right? That's property or wealth. Plunder is when someone else takes the property of another person. They don't want to do the work. Right? And this happens in small ways. This happens in huge ways. Right? So our Father, my Father, your Father, is the wealthiest person that I know. He created wealth. He creates wealth. Active present tense. Right? It's not the Babylonian money magic, create money out of thin air, Federal Reserve notes out of thin air system. Okay? He doesn't do that. He creates real wealth. And wealth is, I'm not merely talking about, it's infinite, it's regenerative, it's ever expanding. It's not finite. And when I say wealth, I'm not merely talking about the tangible stuff. It includes that, the 401k, your stock options, the business that you've created, et cetera, et cetera. It's not merely that. From my point of view, wealth is largely intangible. And it's peppered with a few tangible outcroppings. Right? This produce, this abundance, property, largely intangible. People over profit. Jesus died for people. I mean, it certainly includes, wealth certainly includes people. In my case, in the case of many in here, children. our progeny. You know, the Lord talks about this in many, many different ways in the scriptures. One of my favorites is he talks about children are like arrows in the hands of a warrior. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. You think about a warrior in those times, particularly hand-to-hand combat, a dagger, close range, right? A spear, you keep somebody at 6 feet. A javelin, I've got some distance. I've got a defensive and an offensive advantage if I've got a weapon like a javelin. An arrow, when you think about an arrow, often, at least in the films that we see, the arrows are launched and land beyond where the warrior or the archer can actually see them. It's a long-range weapon. So in that context, children are like arrows in the hands of a warrior. I will strike my enemy in a time and place that I will never see with my children, through my children. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Wealth transcends the stuff that we put in an Excel spreadsheet. It includes it, okay? So, but having said all that, and David's life fraught with hardship like ours, and yet blessing, abundant blessing, David says, I choose you alone is my inheritance. And then he goes on to say, you are my prize. And when you think of prize, what kind of things come to mind? Heisman Trophy, right? A green jacket, maybe. Why green? I don't know, but Nobel Peace Prize. You know, a prize is a reward to the winner, or a reward for an achievement, if you will. Something that we contend for. When I was 8 years old, I took fancy to a particular farm-style truck that was prolific. It was produced in 1949, a 49 Chevy 3100. And I set my eyes on that at 8 years old. I worked as a kid. I sent literally mailed coins to my grandmother. She collected them, put them in a passbook savings account. The day before I turned 15, I bought a 49 Chevy in cash. It was my prize. It's all I thought about. It's what I worked for. I imagined it as I labored and sweat. That's what I thought about, right? It was something I contended for, if you will. We all have our prizes. It could be a position. It could be a certain status in a company or a professional. It could be a vehicle. We have prizes that we contend for. And prize, again, it implies competition. Doesn't have to involve, but it implies competition. You think about competition. Two or more people striving in the same arena for a prize that only one can attain. There's a contest going on for a prize. We contend for it. We fight for it. Above all else, here's what David says. Above all else, you are my prize. You are what I contend for. You are what I'm after. You are what I dream about. Front and center. Among all these other things that he gives his life to, of course. Pleasure. He says, you are my prize. You are my pleasure. What's that? Let's not overcomplicate that. Enjoyment, things that we enjoy, things that are satisfying, things that are fulfilling, great or small. Chocolate is a pleasure to me. It's satisfying. There's something pleasant about it, something fulfilling about it. I take delight in it. I like to build things. I like to see my children thrive, my adult children, as they navigate through life and handle difficulties and problems. My grandchildren give me pleasure. My second grandson turns 1 tomorrow. We're having a party at the house for him. There's nothing I would rather do or spend money on, to be quite frank. Right? So pleasure, these pleasures that we have, and when we think about it, we take our labor units, our time, energy, our money, etc., and we convert those and expend those resources on our pleasures. Nothing wrong with that, right? We make an exchange to bring us pleasure. And David says, above all else, you are my pleasure. Among all these other things that you give to me, you're my pleasure. Portion. He says, you are my portion. We often strive with siblings. I'm the middle of 3 boys. We often strive with siblings over our portion or our fair share, right? Growing up, my oldest brother, Pat, if you're watching this, I still love you very much. He would grab the cereal box in the morning and hog the cereal box, okay? And it's not fair. We were struggling over portion, if you will. And as we've already alluded to in the Hebrew culture, when it came to inheriting the wealth of the multi-generational wealth of the family, the eldest son got a double portion for reasons that we've already indicated, okay? But this portion thing was in play. But it does often kick up or conjure up, wait, that's not fair, okay? And David says here, so in our day, instead of a double portion, it would probably be per stirpes, in your estate, in your will for your children, per stirpes. I got 3 kids, they each get a third. Now, your estate may not be set up that way, don't know, but there's this portion comes into play. Ultimately, here's what David says. You are my portion. You're enough. You're more than enough. I'm satisfied with you as my portion. I don't need anything else. I'm good. So in essence, that's what I think that David is saying here. Destiny. He says, my destiny, you hold my destiny and its timing in your hands. We've touched on this a little bit before in some of the conversations that I've had with you guys over the last year. At one point, I think I shared, and I think of this frequently, but the essence of it would be, in my conversation with the Lord, am I going to be like a William Wallace? Am I going to have a moment? There's something in us that pines or yearns for our lives to be significant, to make a mark, to actually be a world changer. And it's like, well, I'm just an ordinary guy. Is that really going to happen? There's something about certain film or stories that draw us in because it's like, that's so cool. When that guy did that, it pulls on us. There's something about this moment of making a mark as a world changer that pulls on us. And yet the reality is we look in the mirror and go, just an ordinary guy, whatever. Well, here, that question, will my life really amount to anything? I think we're tempted by our enemy to believe. Most honest men that I know will admit that at some point, we struggle, we question. Will my life amount to anything? Will it be anything really significant? I'm not saying we stay there, and some struggle with it more than others, but I think the enemy of our souls tempts us with that. With nothingness and despair and meaninglessness, if you will, right? He certainly did with Solomon. And Solomon landed in a bad place. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Undisputably, probably one of the greatest in many measures that has ever walked on the planet. In terms of tangible wealth, apparently nobody's topped him, right? And yet he even lands in a place like that. So David says here, My destiny and its timing is in your hands. This yearning, destiny, a destination, a place to arrive, right? And we're all familiar with Ronald Reagan's, one of his famous quotes, we have a rendezvous with destiny. Destiny is a place, and it doesn't have to be geography. It could be a place in time, a moment, right? And we arrive at this place, and there's, again, Scripture has plenty. I just wrote down a couple that came to mind as the Lord and I were talking. We ruminated on it together. Esther, for such a time as this. There's a moment where the choice that Esther makes has an impact on history. Joseph, David, Adam, Jesus, okay? And the rest of us in this entire room. Our life is filled with choices, and we don't always know the choice that we're making. A moment in history could be on the other side of that choice. We may not even know that until we get to the other side, right? And so we're pining, if you will, for it. There's something in us as God, I believe, as God's created us for these types of moments. And David says that David accomplished great things, as we know. He had great exploits in battle. And he says about this moment thing, he says to the Lord, my moment and its timing, it's in your hands. Last thing he talks about here, we kind of kicked around, is he says, I'm overwhelmed in Psalm 16, I'm overwhelmed by the privileges that come from following you. Now, privileges, candidly, is a kind of a hot word, a hot topic these days. And I don't want to do anything. My intention is not to marginalize or trivialize some of the truthful elements that may be associated with that term in our culture or in the world today. At the same time, there's God's perspective on things, and there's the world's perspective on things, on all topics, but even on this one, privilege. David says it right here. I'm privileged. I'm overwhelmed by the privileges that come from following you. So when we follow him, certain privileges are part of the package. They come with walking with him. And David says, I'm overwhelmed by those things. Overwhelmed. When my dad turned 65, which has been 30 years ago, he's, like I said, he's deceased, but when he turned 65, myself and my brothers and our wives had a tribute for my father. Invited some people that knew my dad. We got up and said some really heartfelt things about what he had meant to us in his life, just to honor our father. And when I got up and took the microphone, I started sobbing uncontrollably. Now, it was a mixture of gratitude and pain. Now, looking back, I know what it was. At the time, I had no idea what was going on, but I could hardly speak. I couldn't contain my emotion. I just couldn't contain it. It came out. I was overwhelmed. In a sense, I believe that's what David is saying here. I just can't contain I'm overwhelmed by the privileges that come with following you. And this is one of the ways of God. Privilege, I had to look it up in the dictionary. So this is a la Webster's, and then we'll go to the tables in just a second. A special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. A special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. Street version, I got something you don't, you got something I don't. That can sound unfair in a finite planet. It sets the stage for us to compete for finite resources. Fatherless orphans compete for finite resources. Fathered children aren't necessarily in the same position, right? Privilege derived from plunder is antithetical to the kingdom of God. But privilege granted or endowed by the King of Kings to his sons is central to the kingdom of God. It's the way he set it up. And I'm not competing with you for a finite resource. They're unlimited. So David here says, I get you. I not only get what you give me, your blessing, what you provide in your hand, but I get you, the giver, not just the gifts. It's both and here. But that's the emphasis that he places on it in 16:5. 5 questions at your tables. Get to work for 15 or 20 minutes, and I'll pull us back together for a couple of closing remarks. You know, as I've kind of plowed this ground with the Lord and am still doing so, what's manifestly obvious, evident to us all, is really what David's talking about here are choices. He's got a myriad of choices, and among the choices, he says, I choose you alone as my inheritance. I choose you as my pleasure. I choose you as my portion. I choose you as my prize, right? All the other stuff's there. It's a both and, but it's an order of priority, or it's an order about order. There's something about divine order. When things are in the right order, things fall into place. Psalm 37:4, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. I'm not talking name it and claim it. You know that. And there are times when we're like, really, God, come on. I've delighted myself in you, and I got the shaft. Okay, I get that. Nonetheless, delight yourself in the Lord. He delights in us. We delight in him, he delights in us. I have a daughter, 3 sons, 2 are married, got in-laws now. How do I word this? Yeah. Thank you. There are editing capabilities, right? Okay. I'm obviously biased, but I'm reasonably confident if I could step out of myself, I would say the same thing about my own kids. They're enterprising, hardworking, and productive. Thank the Lord. Okay, so much so, my youngest has a tough time receiving. We have a wedding to go to next week. He's 25. It's a whole nother story, but it's a bit of a prodigal story where he's kind of returned. He's Rip Van Winkle that's woken up after 10 years of slumber. Like God has got him in the last few weeks. And so we celebrated last night. We took him to buy him a suit, and because we've got this wedding. And he's like, I'd rather I think having to have things for social functions is a waste of money. That's kind of where he's coming from. He'd rather have, buy 2 pair of overalls. Let's just put it that way. But anyway, they're enterprising. They're productive. And at the same time, so therefore, they're learning as adult children, and I want them to learn this at this stage where they can still ask me for things. In fact, I want them to. It's a pleasure to provide certain things that maybe they're not able to, okay? But it's not like they're looking for a handout or they're mooching or anything. You get my drift? Okay? So income in-laws that are learning our family culture, right? And at times, one might suspect that, one is getting worked for something. And to be honest, I'm okay with that. There's something, I kind of know when I'm getting worked, and they think they don't know that I know that I'm getting worked, but I know that I'm getting worked, and I'm okay with getting worked. I kind of want them to work me. Does that make any sense? And seeing my children mature to a point where they're like, I know my dad. I know how he's going to respond. I can do this. I can ask for it. I just know. So there's something about that that's tied to it. They know me. That's why they'll ask or go there. Does that make sense? I'm trying. I said half-baked. So in that same sense, I think our Father says, work me. Divine order. 1 Kings. I got to wrap it up. We know the story of Solomon. God comes to him in his dream. What do you want? Name it. It's the proverbial genie in the bottle. Get 3 wishes. Like most of you, I usually said my first wishes, I get unlimited wishes. Right? And he says one thing. Name one thing. He says wisdom. Give me wisdom so that I may rule your people with justice. And look at how Father, we know how Father responds. Father goes, bam. Okay, I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to, because you didn't ask for wealth, personal riches, because you didn't ask for me to whack the head off of your enemies, which in today's time, I probably would wish that if I got the wish in the world that we live in right now. But nonetheless, he says, because you haven't, I'm going to give you what you didn't ask for, riches and honor. Bonus round. Okay? That's our Father. And I think he's inviting us to work him. And you know what I mean, in the right sense. He says in Matthew 5, Jesus says it in the Beatitudes, the meek shall inherit the earth. God does have good things in store for us. He gives us good things because he's a good giver. It's who he is. So the things, the riches, the wealth, whatever, the tangible, the intangible, nobody's saying they're bad, they're good. But in the midst of that, David demonstrates for us, you're first, always, you're first. It's relationship. And the Lord's like, okay, bam. So David here is faced with choices. We're faced with choices. Among all the things, what's the order of what we would choose? He's saying as if, look, if I didn't have anything, this is what I want. It's you. You're this, you're that. As it says, as we've looked at in Psalm 16:5. And most people in this room will probably remember the game show. What was the name of it? Monty Hall. Let's make a deal. Door number 1, everybody know what I'm talking about? The young folks, Google it. It's probably out there. Let's make a deal. Door number 1, door number 2, door number 3. You guys remember that? God's basically saying to us right here, let's make a deal. And he tells us what's behind door number 1. He even goes that far to tell us what's behind door number 1. And you get to choose. So we're faced with choices. Let us choose him as our inheritance. Love you, mean it. Have a great weekend. Out for now. Amen.